Hey there. I'm Grace Matthews. I want to share something with you today, something that might shake you a little, make you think. This isn't an easy story for me to tell, but I believe it's one worth hearing. Because honestly, I've spent years hiding from the truth, and it's time to let it breathe. She leans forward, her eyes locking with the camera. There's a softness in her voice, but also an undeniable strength. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I've got more stories coming that I think you'll want to hear. I think for the longest time I had this perfect little version of happiness in my mind. It was so clear to me, like a picture I'd painted in my head. It was simple. It was safe. And it was supposed to last forever. Grace looks off into the distance, as if reflecting on the past. Her fingers lightly trace the edge of her coffee cup. I was married to Alex. We met in college, you know? The kind of romance that feels like destiny. We'd always been so in sync, so connected. In those early years we were inseparable. There was a spark between us that felt unbreakable. Her expression softens and she sighs, running a hand through her hair. But over time things began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. For most of my 20s I was convinced that happiness looked exactly the way I thought it would. Alex and I had a home, a life together that seemed to tick all the right boxes. We had dinner together every night, the house was always in order, and there was this comforting predictability to it all. Her tone takes on a more reflective quality, her gaze dropping to her hands. Alex was steady, reliable. He made me feel safe in the most familiar, predictable ways. There was nothing wrong with it, nothing at all. In fact, it was everything I'd ever thought I wanted. But somewhere along the way I started to feel a gap. It wasn't something I could point to immediately, but as the years passed, I started to notice that the moments between Alex and me were starting to feel empty. The routine that had once felt so comforting, now started to feel stifling. Grace glances out the window, her voice low. Alex was always working. He'd come home late from his job, bury himself in his laptop, and I'd do the same, just, well, without the laptop. We'd talk here and there. But it was like we were two strangers living in the same house, passing each other in silence. It was as if the conversations we once had, about our dreams, our passions, our fears, had somehow disappeared. Her voice falters slightly. I told myself this was just what marriage became after the excitement faded, that it was just a phase. But there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. I started noticing him. Ethan. Her voice softens as she speaks his name, and a distant look enters her eyes. Ethan wasn't new. He'd been around for years, one of Alex's childhood friends. He'd stop by on weekends, always cracking jokes and fixing things around the house, the things Alex just never seemed to get around to. He had this way of lighting up the room, of making everything feel alive. Grace looks directly into the camera for the first time, her eyes more focused. And I started to see him differently, in a way I never had before. Alex was cautious, predictable, you could say. But Ethan? He was spontaneous, daring. He lived in the moment. His hands were rough from the work he did, but it was the kind of work that made him come alive. And when he smiled, it wasn't just a smile. It was a promise of something bigger, something more exciting than the quiet life I'd gotten used to. She shakes her head, almost as if trying to push away a memory. I don't even know when it happened. But one day I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way Ethan's eyes would lock onto mine when we talked, like he was seeing me in a way no one else did. The way his voice would drop when he said something that made me feel seen. Really seen. She pauses, her tone almost wistful. At first, it wasn't anything more than friendly banter. You know? He'd come over to fix something, we'd laugh. He'd ask about my day, and I'd tell him things I hadn't told anyone in years. Little pieces of me I had buried under the weight of being the perfect wife. And then one evening everything changed. Grace closes her eyes briefly, remembering the moment. I handed him a drink, just a simple gesture. But when our fingers brushed, she inhales deeply, as though the memory still lingers. It wasn't just a touch. It was a spark. A jolt. It made my heart race, my breath hitch. Time seemed to stand still for just a moment. And in that instant, I knew things wouldn't ever be the same. Her voice drops to a whisper. I stepped back quickly, telling myself it was nothing, just a fleeting accident. But deep down I knew better. I knew something had changed. From that moment on, every encounter with Ethan was different. The air seemed to hum with something unspoken. The conversations we shared carried a weight that neither of us could deny. And with every passing day, I felt myself pulled deeper into something I wasn't sure I could control. Grace shifts in her chair, as if to shake off the intensity of the memory. It was guilt. It was longing. It was confusion. But it was also something else, something far stronger. A kind of pull I hadn't felt in years. Something that made me question everything about who I was and what I wanted. I didn't want to admit it. I tried to ignore it, to push it away. But Ethan's presence in my life became like an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Every time he was around, I felt alive. In a way I hadn't felt in so long. Grace shakes her head slightly, the regret and longing clearly visible in her eyes. With Alex, everything had become routine, safe, predictable. But with Ethan, every moment felt like an adventure, even if it was just a simple conversation. And in those moments I realized that I had been hiding from something. From myself. From the parts of me that I had buried. Her voice grows more introspective. Maybe this was the first time in my life I had truly felt awake. Grace looks directly at the camera once more, her eyes earnest. I don't know where this story goes from here. Maybe I'll figure it out. Maybe I won't. But I do know one thing. I've never been this honest with myself before. And that's where this story begins. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll share what happened next. And as always, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next in this journey.